Namaskar, hello and welcome viewers. You're watching the special presentation of Sansad TV, Bills and Acts, where we analyze bills that impact you, acts that empower you, and programs that matter to you. I'm your host Kriti Mishra, and today the spotlight is on India's polar endeavours. In recent years, India has played an increasingly prominent role on the world stage, and this has also been evident in the polar regions. The three poles, the Arctic, Antarctic, and the Himalayas, are connected through risks and vulnerabilities of changing climate systems and are an integral part of the global commons. Before the detailed analysis on why India has a significant stake in the Arctic, let's take a look at the highlights. India has unveiled Arctic policy titled India and the Arctic, Building a Partnership for Sustainable Development. India is one of the 13 nations holding observer status in the Arctic Council. India maintains that all human activities should be sustainable, responsible, transparent, and based on respect for international laws. So why is Arctic important for us? Well, India's engagement with the Arctic dates back to a century when Svalbard Treaty was signed in February 1920 in Paris, and today India is undertaking several scientific studies and research in the Arctic region. The Arctic has 8 states: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Rajya, Sweden, and the US that comprise the Arctic Council. It is home to about 4 million, a tenth of them being indigenous tribes. Though none of India's territory directly falls in the Arctic region, it is a crucial area as the Arctic influences atmospheric, oceanographic, and biogeochemical cycles of the Earth's ecosystem. Due to climate change, the region faces the loss of sea ice caps, and warming of the ocean, which in turn impacts the global climate. The frigid Arctic, which keeps losing ice due to global warming, is one of the batteries feeding the variations in Indian monsoons. And for deeper understanding of India's position in the region, I'm joined by a very illustrious panel of guests in the studio. Joining us, Dr. M. Ravichandran, Secretary, Ministry of Earth Sciences; Mr. Pankaj Saran, former Deputy National Security Advisor of India; Dr. Sasmit Patra, Member of the Upper House of Parliament and represents the BJD; and Sulagna Chattopadhyay, she heads the think tank Science and Geopolitics of Himalaya-Arctic and Antarctic. I welcome all of you on Sansad Television. And also in the studio, we have with us a very vibrant audience of young researchers and scholars. I welcome all of you on Sansad TV and thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Ravichandran, let me begin the program with you. India has unveiled the Arctic policy. Now, it drew a lot of global attention, given the situation that we are in right now. Take us through the key highlights of the policy.
Under the global warming scenario and the climate change is happening, one of the important regions, especially the polar regions, are become hot topic in the world. Mainly because the 3 reasons. One is the availability of resources will be explored, and the second is the climate change effect in the Arctic region will affect in the entire globe. That is number 2. And the number 3 is the major shipping route, the shipping corridor of the global shipping corridor will change because of the northern sea route. Under these 3 important phenomena changes, I think globally everybody is looking at the Arctic. However, India is having Arctic policy. It is having mainly with the 6 pillars. Number 1 is we drive first from science and research, and second one is environment and its protection, environmental protection. And the third one is, of course, the economic affairs as well as the human development. And the fourth one is the connectivity and transportation. And the fifth one is, obviously, it is a capacity building. And especially in the Arctic region, how we want to build the capacity and other things. Right. And maybe lastly, we are also interested in governance and international cooperation in the Arctic regions. So these are the major 6 pillars we have aimed at in the Arctic policy.
All right, so those were the 6 pillars of our Arctic policy. But Mr. Saran, let's talk about the geopolitical significance of the region. The economic dividends, of course, so we know that this is perhaps the largest untapped hydrocarbon territory. And also about India's interests given the global situation right now, the turmoil between Russia and Ukraine. How important or how well-timed is this policy?
Yes, thank you. I think this is an excellent initiative taken by the government to announce an Arctic policy. We became observers in 2013, and it has taken so long for India and the entire Government of India system to come up with a coherent framework. We are one of the 13 observer countries. The only other Asian countries or observers are actually Japan and South Korea and Singapore perhaps. But as an observer, it is incumbent on us to also put forward our own vision for the region. Unlike the Antarctic, the Arctic is actually, despite all the statements to the contrary, it is an area of geopolitical contestation. And you have the Arctic Council, as you mentioned, plus you have three big players. You have the United States, Russia, and China. And we have to keep in mind that 50% of the coastline in the Arctic lies on Russian territory. So therefore, our relationship with Russia becomes extremely critical when we have to discuss the Arctic issues, because Russia is the most dominant player. There is also a subtle competition of resources and infrastructure and power underway between Russia and China in the Arctic, because the Russians perceive the Arctic to be their own backyard. Number three, as the Secretary very correctly said, as the seas warm, as the Arctic warms, the prospect of a possible northern sea route connecting Asia to Europe is an imminent possibility, and that could have a serious impact on the use of the Indian Ocean as a transit for trade and commerce. And if that happens, then we may have to revise all our traditional assumptions about the importance of the Indian Ocean. So the northern sea route is something which has not yet been fully studied in India, and that is really important. And lastly, I would just say, as you mentioned, that the Arctic is full of resources. And if India has to grow at 8 to 10% a year, we have to have the legal and administrative and jurisdictional instruments to be able to harness those resources.
Absolutely. But Mr. Saran, those are fairly complicated issues. Let me take that to Dr. Patra. Dr. Patra, you've often raised questions in Parliament on India's space expeditions, on India's polar expeditions. Now, as Mr. Saran mentioned about the global complicated issues as far as Arctic is concerned, as a lawmaker, how do you think that there should be an interplay between science, policy, and law to solve these complicated issues?
I think it's a very nice thought process that has been brought about by the government with respect to Arctic. And as a lawmaker, I believe the recent example of the Antarctica bill that has been passed by the Parliament really shows that how Indian Parliament can continue to legislate matters which are going to have serious implications not only for India in terms of the polar region, but would also really impact India's presence among the High Committee of Nations. I'll just refer to Antarctica bill and then probably come back to the Arctic aspect. You see, Antarctica bill, the reason was that there are international treaties. I'm not going into it because of the lack of time. But those international treaties had to be respected by a mechanism within the Indian domain of law, which has been brought in by the Indian Antarctica Bill 2022, which has now become a law. Similarly, when we talk about the Arctic region, the fact is in 1920, about 100 years back, we had the Svalbard Treaty. And thereafter, there have been a series of activities that have really taken place in the Arctic region. But what has really happened is, in terms of legislating matters, which would make India more robust, more strong, I'm sure the government is seized of the matter. I personally saw how, though this entire monsoon session that we had was very stormy, only 5 bills could be passed, but one of the priority bills was the Antarctica bill. And that really shows the commitment and the dedication of the government and the will of the government, the political will, to ensure that legislation by lawmakers passes scrutiny, and we go ahead and we ensure such laws that will help us to work strongly, not only in the polar regions, but also assert, as Saranji has already said, as Honorable Secretary has said, that India's position in the High Committee of Nations has to be backed by legislation internally. So not only will the treaties internationally will help, but when those countries are going to look back at India and say, do you have mechanisms like high committees that allow permits and other things for expeditions? And do you have an inner control within your system to ensure that those who are going to come and explore are also vetted by the government? That is where legislation is going to be important. And that is where Antarctica bill, in fact, is a pathfinder going forward for many such areas in the polar region.
Pathfinders, as you said, and you also talked about political will. I'll take that to you, madam. He talked about political will. We always underscored that there's lack of articulated policy. Now that we have the policy in the public domain, and also a very important aspect that Arctic's weather impacts Indian monsoons. What are the other gaps that we need to address going forward?
Yeah. So now, just a little bit, I'll just go back. I mean, this is all policy and we require the policy, but just to make the connect that why is science and geopolitics so closely linked in the Arctic? I mean, just I want to put out over there that, you've probably seen these maps where they show the sea ice, winter, summer pulsations. It's called the pulsating continent, the polar regions. And these pulsations are like, if you just imagine this, a human being breathing on an annual scale. So it's like it maintains the circulation of your body, the circulation, the blood, the oxygen, and all of that. So now this is global. Now look at it at a global scale. So we have things like the Rossby waves and things that are actually affecting our monsoons. And we have young people here who already done work on that. And how even Uttarakhand floods, for example, the Kedarnath disaster is linked to the Rossby waves. And Sir has a paper on that as well about how these circulations, they are all actually mixed up as of now. There are these quasi-systems, transitionary systems that are coming up. And all of that requires us to understand what is really happening up in the circulation when these pulsations are, they're changing. Now, therein, our role becomes very important. It becomes important to be there. And that is why science. But these are 8 sovereign nations. They are countries which own lands. We can't just walk into them because we need science. So we need a policy. We need a mechanism so that we can walk into them. We can tell them that, okay, we help you and you help us. So the mechanism has to be both ways. We help them and they help us. And that is why the policy is extremely important for us to not only help ourselves, but in the process also help them.
Mr. Saran, I'll take a quick comment on that. As Madam said, you help us, we help you.
That's absolutely true. I think what this policy represents is a switch from just the pure science approach to the Arctic to a bigger political strategic approach. And as the Honorable Member of Parliament said, if you look, it's a futuristic document because when India rises, and we are rising as a nation, then you need to be there where it matters. And for all the reasons given in the policy, it matters for India to be in the Council as an observer to justify and legitimize our position. Because please do remember that when you look at a country like China, which is not a member of the Arctic Council as far as I'm aware, the kind of strides they have taken in terms of their presence there is something which we need to take cognizance of. And so therefore, this transition from a simple science approach to a bigger strategic approach and a political approach is critical. And the Arctic, unfortunately, the members of the Council do not like it, but it is locked between the United States, Russia, and a bit of China at the extreme end towards Vladivostok. So whether we like it or not, it has become an area of acute contestation, differences, territorial disputes, the Himalayas, the ocean rising and rise in temperatures, etc. We have a stake.
Right. We have a stake. On that note, let's take some questions from our audience here. Please go ahead.
So my question is for Pankaj sir. That as Arctic ice is melting, so resources are becoming easily accessible, explorable. They can be easily extracted too. So is the resource battle between US and Russia will lead to the polarization of world in near future, or the polarization has already started?
I think the polarization is there, but it's under control. It's within certain guardrails, so they don't allow this to go beyond a certain point. But as resources become more accessible, countries will begin to be more assertive and more open about their narrow selfish interests. And since we are already observers, and since our needs are going to be very, very high as we grow for natural resources, for precious metal, semi-precious metal, for oil, for gas, etc., we have to be also very cognizant of what is going on. I would also say, apart from the US-Russia, you're also facing, as I mentioned to you, a very subtle competition for influence between Russia and China. And this is not readily understood. Actually, the Russians are quite uncomfortable with the Chinese aggressive posture which the Chinese are using through huge amounts of money, through these trans-Arctic voyages, through the building of port infrastructure, etc. So there is a big game going on there, and we have to develop enough capacity in our own country.
Some suggested that this polar sea ice melt is impacting the Indian monsoon. I have also published recently paper where I found the Indian monsoon is impacting through polar sea ice melt. So my question is very general. So everyone actually talking about these problems like impacting. So no one is talking about a solution. How can we reduce this melting?
See, the nature, we cannot stop it. Okay, whatever is happening, it is a global warming scenario. It has happened long back. So now we cannot suddenly stop it. As you all know that monsoon, whatever the heavy rain, whatever occurring in India, that always transport heat to the Arctic. In turn, Arctic, because of that heat, Arctic ice is melting again. And that melt again, whenever the sea ice reduction is happening, then the India, we get a heavy precipitation rain. That means extreme rainfall is increasing. That is what we are telling about Uttarakhand and other heavy rainfall events are increasing. So now, under the global warming scenario, the extreme rains are increasing. Then you have a two problem. That means it will be many places it will be flood, and some other places you will have a drought. Right. So now how to combat these type of things we have to equip. Maybe more and more ponds we have to create. Now if it is a heavy downpour is happening, it is just going in the some other places, especially in the coastal region, it goes to sea. So how to store this water? That is what we have to adaptation and mitigation strategy we have to plan. You have to reduce the carbon dioxide.
True.
Or you have to carbon sequestration you have to do. So that is a long process, but in the short term, we have to mitigation and adaptation strategy we have to plan.
Yes, Dr. Patra, you wanted to add?
Yeah, just adding to what Honorable Secretary spoke about. You see, since you are already a scholar, you are aware about the Paris Agreement, right? We have always talked about how climate change can be impacted. One aspect of what Paris Agreement is, whatever in letter and spirit has been written, is it being followed? The fact is, with all due respect, United States walked out of the Paris Agreement a couple of few years back, right? So when we talk about, and I'm not going into the politics of it, all I'm trying to say is, we are, and I'll give you a personal experience. I was part of the Indian parliamentary delegation to the Inter-Parliamentary Union in Belgrade in 2019. And we, as India, actually moved an emergency resolution on climate change. It was accepted, we discussed. In the negotiation, I was the rapporteur for the committee. If you look at the G12, the European Union along, because US is not part of the IPU, but the entire focus was on India and the developing nations. You stop using resources. When we asked, you have already used 35% of the resources available on this planet. So there has to be a shared responsibility. We've always said we want to stop the glaciers melting. We want to reduce the climate change. We want to ensure that the emissions are reduced. But at the same point of time, the technology that is there with you should be provided to us.
Right.
But you want to sell the technology to us at very exorbitant prices, which will shoot up our input costs. And then you also expect us to reduce the emissions.
We are aware that indigenous people organizations are major stakeholders in Arctic region. So I want to know how India is cooperating and co-opting with these indigenous populations living around the Arctic.
Madam, you would like to take that one?
Yeah, so now I don't know if you're aware, but do you know that the censuses that are conducted in these countries, they don't list the indigenous communities. So we really don't know the status of what these indigenous communities are going through. So it is mostly anecdotal. So we have information through anecdotes and people come up with reports. But the census does not give us any information. Now what is... Okay. Yeah, tell me. Ask
yeah,
me.
ma'am, I want to add, but there are some independent organizations.
So these
like
organizations
Council,
are in the Arctic Council. So they are, for example, the Sami, and then the Nenets. Yeah. Then there are Inuits. So these all organizations, they are part of the Arctic Council. Yeah. And there is a quasi, there's the governance structures are different. So they have right to their land. So there is, if you understand that there's a reindeer corridor. Reindeers can't be captive. They don't breed. So they have to move. There are migratory paths are there. So they have to have access to that land. So they have land rights. And so if you develop an oil, say you want an oil rig to be developed there, an offshore oil platform to be developed, then you share that with the indigenous community. But India really doesn't have any scope to interact with them on a personal level. So we do with the country. So we will be with the 8 countries and then we will try to do cooperation with them.
China is also building this polar Silk Road, which Russia has backed. So how do you see that nexus? Because you just said that there is a lot of contestation between China and Russia. Yeah, so.
So the Russian preeminence of the Arctic is a fact of geography, and it cannot be taken away. What Russia is trying to also do, like everyone else, is to see whether the northern sea route, whether it will ever become operational, and if so, and what time frame. Are we looking at 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Because the rate of warming is increasing rapidly. If the northern sea route becomes a viable, because they already are using it for travel, for trade in goods, and container traffic is already plying through. So they look at it as an opportunity, economic and a strategic opportunity. Insofar as China is concerned, China is also viewing it with the same lens. But because they have far more economic, financial resources, they are also looking at the opportunity of developing a whole series of ports along the Russian coastline. But the Russians realize that if they give a free pass to the Chinese, you could actually have a situation where the Chinese begin to control the northern sea route, and that the Russians will never allow.
So given that, as you had mentioned earlier, China does not have an observer status in the Arctic Council, but China's investments in the Arctic Sea is very well known. Given we all know that about China's escapades in expansion, how grave is the threat of militarization in the Arctic Sea, given that an alternate sea route through the Northern Sea could be totally under the control of China, given their investments there at the current rate?
Firstly, I think China is a member of the Observer Council, is an observer nation, but it's not a member of the Arctic Council.
Yeah.
So, like us, they are also observers. The militarization of the Arctic is something which the members of the Arctic Council are extremely worried about. And if you look at the entire charter of the Council and all the records of all the meetings, etc., they pay, lip service to the fact that we will never allow militarization of the Arctic. But the fact of the matter is there is a very high degree of mutual suspicion, especially between the Americans and the Russians, and between the Nordics and the Russians, about the intentions of each other. But on paper, in terms of the legal charter, it is supposed to be a completely non-military zone. So that's how it is.
Sir, as we see that Russia being most influential player in Arctic region, as it has its coastline and its population there, that is very much more than other countries. And so, sir, my question would be, where does Russia stand when we see India's Arctic policy?
Right now, as I understand, we are making our presence felt. I mean, in my humble opinion, I think Dr. Saran and Honorable Secretary can add to it. But we are making our presence felt, while Russia and several other countries have already been there, done it kind of places, right? So, by India actually walking into the council, becoming an observer status and actually creating its presence, we will start engaging more at the policy level at the point of time. We've not made any major investments so far as compared to the Russians or the Chinese. Going forward, I think if you look at the geopolitics of it, that's one part that we have just made an entry. And over a period of time, we will start engaging and then investing. That's how the process would go on. But as far as our relationship, so to say, with Russia, or you to say, whether we have been called out by various countries, and our Honorable External Affairs Minister very rightly has made lovely statements saying our position in terms with Russia's oil, other things are very clearly laid out. And everybody has kept quiet. I'm sure Russia looks at India as a very potential strength and a friend in that region.
Right.
Especially given our presence with China in terms of our strategic dialogues, as far as what is happening across the border. I think Russia is going to seek our help on various matters. And as Dr. Saran has rightly mentioned, going forward, Russia will not be giving a blank check to the Chinese at all. And coming back to the militarization process also, mutual trust deficit is the reason usually that militarization really builds up.
For what are the future career options for the young research scholars as far as India is concerned? Because we are having a human resource potential, and what about making that potential as a climate workforce?
I think that's a fantastic question, sir. What about future career options?
Yeah, I think you have made 2 points. What are the engagement to reach the policy? I think for rightly Honorable MP says that we have to engage our interaction with the Arctic nations. See, for that, the first vehicle which we are using is a science. And it is also indirectly, it is used directly for us. As I mentioned that directly it is impacting monsoon and other things. So we are going for enhancing the science knowledge in the Arctic by way of observing system, understanding. So our people are going there and try to understand the system, what is happening there. So initially now we have started with what is called one place in Svalbard, but now this year again we are going to Canadian region of Arctic, and we are planning to go for Greenland. So we are just to try to expand our science presence in all the Arctic regions. Now when we want to understand the Arctic region and other things, I think unfortunately we have not studied glaciology, that type of domain. So we need to develop that knowledge here, human development, human resource development we have to develop. So once we develop that one, I think more and more youngsters has to participate to understand the Arctic, because it is not that one small few people can do. So we need a large pool of knowledge resources. For that, I think youngsters has to come forward to go for more and more research, not only for observation, understanding, but also the prediction of weather and climate for the future.
Absolutely, and I'm completely out of time on the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Saran, Dr. Ravichandran, Dr. Patra, and Sulagna ji. Well, viewers, that's all we had for you in this edition. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Sansad TV. Namaskar.